welcome to this first ever live recording of Inside Briefing, the IfG's weekly podcast. I'm Hannah White, the IfG's director and podcast presenter. If you're a regular listener, we're really delighted that you can be with us today. If you're new to Inside Briefing, a very warm welcome, and we hope you'll immediately subscribe. If you're watching at home, we'll do our best to bring our studio vibe to you wherever you're watching. And if you're listening back later in the week, we hope you enjoy this special episode. So I'm here today with two brilliant IfG colleagues, our chief economist, Gemma Tetlow. Hi, Gemma.
Hello.
And our senior fellow, Giles Wilkes. Hi, Giles. And I'm absolutely delighted that we are joined here today by Dan Snow, author, historian, TV presenter, and of course, presenter of the HistoryHit podcast. Hi, Dan.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So because this is a slightly different type of podcast and because Dan is with us, we're going to take a step back from the usual Inside Briefing format, and we're going to try to look at the extraordinary political times we've been living through a historical lens. But let's start with the here and now, when every day seems to bring news of a new strike and another piece of the UK's public services grinding to a halt. Dan, are we reliving the 1970s all over again?
Well, I think this is the boring answer you'd expect from someone immersed in history. Sort of. There are similarities and there are differences. On the one hand and the other, 1972, you get the first big coal miner strike since the Second World War. 1973, and this is a time when Britain's almost entirely dependent on coal and imported oil. Coal and oil. 1973, you get another strike, you get a railway strike. You also then get the October 73 war in the Middle East, so-called Yom Kippur War, which the OPEC jack up prices by a multiple and therefore imports. So you've got a big supply side shock that we got today, and then you get rampant inflation, interest rates, I think to 11% by the 74 election, your sort of inflation, although you could tell me sort of, 19% or something like that, so it will go higher. So it's not as bad, I think, as that. Also, should we say railways, every other industry was dependent on the railways, and it was still the railways were still enormously powerful, so that was catastrophic. And those strikes were not sort of one day here, that the strikes were, you were on strike until there was a resolution, or they were longer strikes as well. So I think that is very similar. We got an energy commodity shock. We have got inflation, which is leading for requests for higher wages. So some bits are quite similar. Although I think it's quite similar to 1847 as well. Perhaps we'll come to that in a bit.
We'll come to that in a minute. Giles.
I mean, one of the comparisons I thought really apt at the beginning. If you remember back to this summer, Liz Truss liked having striking poses that were very similar to Margaret Thatcher. That was her way, basically, to win the Conservative elections, was say you're going to get another Thatcher here. And I've always thought it would have been much funnier and more appropriate if she dressed up as Edward Heath, or maybe appeared at a grand piano or trying to sail a yacht, because all of the comparisons, as Dan has given with examples there, should be with him coming in and doing a massive inflationary budget that then gets out of control and ends up with her asking who governs Britain and everyone saying it's not you. I think you could have predicted quite early that she was going to be much more like Heath than Thatcher.
But in the end, the strife in the 1970s did come to an end. So what are the lessons that politicians now should learn from that?
Well, the lessons are that everything ends eventually.
Eventually.
I mean,
we wait long enough.
Without getting too philosophical, the trouble is sometimes they end with the Cossacks watering their horses in the Seine, and sometimes they end in other ways. So that's not, I'm afraid I haven't got to be particularly helpful.
Not so helpful.
I mean, just to come in on this, I totally agree with Dan and Giles that there are definitely parallels. We've got huge inflation driven by an energy price shock, a lot of strikes, but there are big differences in the scale of strikes we've got now compared to what we had in the 1970s. So we lost 467,000 days to strike action in November, which is the latest data available, but that compares to kind of 24 million days lost to strike action in 1972, 30-odd million lost in the winter of discontent of 1979. It's on a totally different scale. And I guess the lesson that Thatcher learnt was to hugely overhaul strike legislation. So now you don't have a bunch of guys sitting in a room doing a show of hands of, shall we go out on strike? You've actually got much more restrictions on when they can go out on strike. So
Although we have got strike legislation, so there's a...
Yeah.
anti-strike legislation. Giles, looking at crises more generally, obviously we've had the pandemic recently. Are there lessons you think from history for today's politicians about how to handle crises well?
Well, I mean, the most testing thing I could ever be asked to do is to say something favourable about the way Boris Johnson behaved in the last sort of 3 years. But I would say that aspects of the response of his administration to the pandemic were admirable. And they showed that actually a crisis will elicit behaviour out of a government that you wouldn't normally expect. If you'd described to an IfG seminar before the pandemic, this is what's going to happen, this is what you're going to need to bring into effect really quickly, in particular, getting that testing regime up really, really fast, encouraging people to stay at home, which, remember, the conventional wisdom in March 2020 was maybe 2 or 3 weeks, but then people are going to riot. Some of the communications there, getting people behind it. I would say that one of the lessons is that crises do elicit a response. Unfortunately, what it did also reveal is that we have hopelessly poor preparation for crises here. We got rid of some of the investment in preparing for things like pandemics. And we also, as a sort of almost a matter of ideology in the country, try to run things as efficiently as possible in the public sector, which means as little capacity as possible. We're really learning that with the NHS right now, that we try to get the highest possible return on assets, but we don't look at what happens if the demand for this shoots through the roof. So we need to learn in future that you need more capacity, and that sometimes means just investing and not seeing a return for a very long time.
And Dan, I mean, in wartime, production gets ramped up, opposition parties work together. I mean, maybe we should always run government on a war footing.
Yeah, well, we could do. I think that in my lifetime, which is very short, we've been through several crises. You know, we've had the winter discontent. I've had Falklands War. I've had pitched battles taking place outside collieries. Someone tried to kill the Prime Minister with a mortar just down the road. You know, I mean, we've had bombs blown up in this city. We've had pandemics, and 2008, when we were genuinely worried about the global financial system not working anymore. I mean, it's astonishing. So we've had an extinction level sort of pandemic worry. I mean, I remember back, 2 years ago now, we were watching images of blowtorches like stopping Chinese residents leaving power, and we thought this could be the 28 days later scenario. Like, thankfully, for many reasons, it didn't turn out like that. So in the last 20 years, we've had a extinction level. You had sort of a major global pandemic and a major concerns that the post-1690s economic settlement is going to collapse. I mean, that's pretty intense. So actually crisis is kind of the norm, I think, in many ways. And I reckon that most of our previous prime ministers probably feel that their terms were dominated by kind of their response to crisis. But yeah, I mean, wartime, reaching out across the aisle. And I think the opposition probably deserves some credit in terms of not trying to, unlike in the US, I think the opposition, if you look at the Falklands or you look at COVID, they were quite responsible, I think, in how they chose to conduct themselves. I mean, arguably, in the case of COVID and Downing Street, we now would think perhaps there should have been more scrutiny. Perhaps Parliament should have maintained its scrutiny role a little bit more robustly than it did. I think, so, and then in a wider sense, experts. Again, we see it in COVID. Communication, honesty. Churchill, reasonably honest. You know, they had blood, sweat, and tears. Dunkirk, not a great. All that sort of how we're going to win. It's going to take a long time, but we think we can win it by doing these things. And I think that Brexit is a kind of poison pill at the moment because it doesn't enable people, including Labour Party, to be entirely honest about anything. Because you cannot say, I'm doing everything I can to get Britain out, because obviously there's a big old lever that you could pull or attempt to pull that would undo some of that damage. And then expert-led stuff. I mean, I'm kind of a geek and naive, much more naive than you guys. I'm like, I like royal commissions and gathering brilliant people together to talk about, whether it's embryology or in the past it's done very well. And it strikes me that does well in a crisis as well.
I think it's kind of Dan was getting at there. There's loads of good stuff about the crisis reactions, innovation, doing things quickly, clarity of objectives. But you did set aside some of the other processes of policy making which actually do have value. So the parliamentary scrutiny, some of the checks and balances. In the crisis, you do what's needed and probably a bit more to make sure you don't underachieve, but in normal times, actually, you do need to go through those processes of thinking, actually, is this the best way of achieving what we can do? Is this value for money? Could we do things a bit more effectively? So some of that, I think, needs to come back in non-crisis.
The VIP fast lane was not something that
Yes.
The other, obvious point, but it's really expensive dealing with crises.
Yes.
Right? What is the, where is government now in terms of the precedents that have been set in the course of, pandemic, energy support? How hard is it to reverse out of, this is such a crisis, we're going to spend lots of money on it?
I think it is difficult. I think expectations have shifted. Big hit to the economy during the pandemic, and the government stepped in and paid people's wages. Does beg the question, why doesn't the government do that in normal types of...
Can I say also that we were lucky in that we have had, I think there's been several great crises since the turn of the century. 9/11 felt like one. 2008 was extraordinary. For us, there was Brexit and the war in Ukraine, as well as COVID. If any of them had turned up at the same time, in particular, if the pandemic had turned up 10 years earlier, around the time of the financial crisis, the banks would have all absolutely collapsed. There's no way the Treasury could have reacted quickly enough to recapitalise them in a COVID situation with the economy down 20%. And I think it feels like we've had a really awful time, but compared to the outcomes we've seen like in the 30s or the extreme deprivation post-war, like the 1947 winter, which was just absolutely dreadful and would have killed so many people. Maybe we should reflect on the fact we've got record low unemployment and we're dealing with debt of 90%, but it's affordable. Maybe we haven't come out too badly.
Yeah, I think what we don't need isn't a posh, rich white guy on a chair saying everything's fine. But to a certain extent, looked at through the historical lens, of course, we are, the crisis, the financial crisis of 1847, which was a government attempting to both cut taxes, go for growth, and deal with the potato famine, was catastrophic, led to direct immiseration, massive amounts of death of UK citizens, and led effectively to, in the longue durée, to the breakup of the UK as well, just obliterated whatever consent the Irish might have had to the UK project. So, I know it's not super helpful, but sometimes when you do look back, you think, I think we're doing okay.
Could be worse.
Yeah.
Giles, looking back at history, it's easy now to sort of think, well, why can't we get things done? Why can't we solve the problems in the NHS? Was it just easier to do stuff in the past?
I must admit, I'm somewhat mystified by this. There were several facts that come to my mind. Like, I was told by a friend who studied military history that at the outset of the Second World War, America was making 900 planes, the whole of America, a year. And within a couple of years of FDR getting Harry Hopkins to get on the case, they were making 90,000. And within a couple of years, they were producing the equivalent to the entire Japanese Navy every 3 or 4 days. There was an ability to ramp up production that and we were apparently an even more efficient war economy. We were just able to turn things around extraordinarily. My other example, but more within our sort of sphere, Roy Jenkins spent, a couple of years as Home Secretary, never expected to be. He came in because of the devaluation crisis and replaced Callaghan. And in his short time there, I think he legalised abortion and homosexuality and reformed the prisons, and did it all when it wasn't actually part of the big government agenda and he didn't have much prime ministerial support. And he seemed to do it with 2-hour lunch breaks and a night at the opera. And yet somehow, and no email. And maybe the answer was no email. So I do think there's something very strange about how much we're gumming ourselves up with processes. You don't have to be a sort of Telegraph reading, aren't there stupid regulations around, to wonder whether we have to go through more processes to do the same thing.
I think, I agree, of course, wartime production. You go from canvas biplanes during the Second World War to first man-made objects entering space, swept wing, jet fighters into space of 6 years. It's astonishing how creative we can be when we've got a crisis, we've got unlimited amount of money to spend. And let alone the Manhattan Project, which was unimaginable. However, I think the vaccine rollout was great. I don't want to sound like a Conservative minister here, but 11 months from analysing the genetic structure of the disease to into people's arms is extraordinary, given the previous record I think was 5 or 6 years. And I think actually that electrification, I know there's much more to do, but I think we should take enormous satisfaction from our, the offshore wind, the the electrification of our grid inputs is remarkable and hasn't been done with enormous dislocation, and actually can make you think to yourself, well, given what you've just said and given with vaccines, like, why don't we just click off and get that done overnight? Like, it's crazy. We stick a lot of windmills and some mud off this coast. It's absurd. Just double it.
And it's actually something that the IFG is going to be looking at this year. Let's move on to talk about politicians. You started us off on this track, Giles, but Dan, does every generation think its politicians are less heavyweight than the ones that went before?
Absolutely. Absolutely do. But in our case, it's true. No, so I've actually uncharacteristically done some preparation for this podcast. I've got some astonishing quotes, which I hope you'll enjoy. There was you'll have heard of the government of all the talents, which was a name, the government did not include all the talents, narrator voice. The Prime Minister Grenville wrote to his brother in 1807 after he'd been kicked out of office about the Tories that replaced him. They are really the shabbiest set of dirty politicians that was ever seen. Now, we ought to point out that set of politicians went on to win Napoleonic Wars in the next 8 years. Cicero wrote, "The current regime is the most infamous, disgraceful, and uniformly odious to all classes of people that Rome has ever had," which I thought was a good one. Charles Dickens wrote, "If I ever destroy myself, it will be in the bitterness of hearing those infernal and damnably good old times extolled." So the idea that politicians are always better in the past, I think, is untrue. And actually, the last one, because we are where we are, George IV, who was not a man to speak, who was himself fairly hopeless, he wrote of Goderich. Goderich's prime minister was a damned, snivelling, blubbering blockhead. It's probably one of the truest things George IV ever said. But yeah, I think it's, when we see these statues, when we hear, we edit out, we hear very partial stories of those who've gone before. I think we're tempted to think that our own politicians have feet of clay compared to them.
But I think it is true that politicians today don't necessarily have the long careers that some of the politicians in the past, and particularly I would say women politicians have coming in, even some who do quite senior jobs are choosing to leave politics relatively quickly.
Yeah.
Is that a change?
I think, yes, I think so. I mean, people would come, but there were certainly in the 19th century, the kind of absolute, the Avengers generation of politician, which is your Stanley, your Gladstone, your Palmerston. They were incredibly long-serving. Palmerston was involved in the victory over Napoleon at a kind of junior ministerial level, extraordinary, and would go on to become prime minister in the 1850s. So and I think even Blair, Cameron had, we all know, an incredibly short career from entering Parliament to almost being a very successful prime minister in such a short amount of time. So I think that yes, it does. It is strange, and it's so striking now that we celebrate Theresa May staying on the back benches, for example, or Ed Miliband, and how the Parliament is much the better for both of the presidents of both those two people. So yes, I think that has changed.
But I just find it really interesting. I have no idea on the history of this. That is this a good thing, or do we? Because in other jobs, you'd think that you do a bad job, you get kicked out, and someone else comes in and you get new perspectives would be a good thing. But then you have people like Churchill, who had a terrible First World War and an amazing Second World War. I don't know, what's the history of are these, was there just no challenge? Or?
Annoyingly, the history is mixed on that one. I have days, we all have days when we think the whole thing should be turfed out. Citizens' Assembly every 5 years, brand new set of people drawn from amongst us to make these decisions. and then of course we have days when 2008, I think we think, good thing Gordon Brown sort of knew his way around the financial system. Alistair Darling, they knew where, they seemed like the right people there at the time and for that kind of the acute crisis phase. But
I think it's also more exhausting in that within our lifetimes, it was the case that an MP might just visit his constituency a few times. It was nearly always a few times a year, just walk by. And nowadays, apparently one of the phrases I was most proud to hear was the Liberal Democrats ruined it. by making everybody have all these doorstep campaigns and wander around promising to keep every post office open and every playground open. And it's meant the job of being a minister is one of the most extraordinary things I noticed when I was advising Vince Cable was on Friday, he was an MP again and had to be there. And you don't hear about Palmerston or Churchill or Gladstone having
Churchill and Dundee? Churchill popping back to Dundee? Or
just to listen to
no, you don't.
Yeah.
I think it was a once-a-year job at best, yeah.
So is it harder to be a Prime Minister today?
In some ways. However, Pitt, the younger, drank himself to death as Prime Minister. The office broke him. I think that Aberdeen was pretty broken by the office. So I think there are examples of the responsibilities of office overwhelming people back in the 18th and 19th century as well. But yes, I think there's probably...
There seemed to be an off-season. Parliament wouldn't sit.
Yes, that's true.
If you read Trollope's The Prime Minister, and half of it is about the parties. But literally...
exhausting. It's exhausting.
But because, what were we going to do for 6 months when Parliament isn't?
Wasn't that also because the Thames smelt so foul in the summer that they couldn't sit in Parliament?
Heading back that way.
And Gemma, is it harder to be Chancellor now?
I was thinking about this, and actually when I was thinking about the podcast, in a way I was thinking there's loads more information that helps you as Chancellor, whatever your job is, to know what's going on, to make decisions. On the other hand, I guess the flip side of that is there is more information for you to process, and there are answers to questions that I guess in the past politicians just had to go with their gut instinct or their ideology and plump for it. So I don't know, I think it's a bit pros and cons of having more available to you.
We're doing well at the pros and cons.
Yeah, no, it's really unhelpful, isn't it? For some reason, I've just thought about...
when you get a historian on...
Oh, no, it's useless.
They didn't have to finance as much. I mean, nobody had an argument about raising the state pension because there wasn't one. They'd have an argument every now and again about how many dreadnoughts.
How many ships the line to build.
Yeah,
exactly.
And there's some argument, should it be 4 or 6? And we argued, and then we decided on 8.
That's Lloyd George, exactly,
And bringing this all together, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, Giles, the centre of government, is it fit for purpose now? Is there a halcyon period in the past we should look back to and emulate?
30 years ago, it was always better run. I mean, it feels like it was designed for another era, because being on the inside of Downing Street, as many of you will be, it doesn't feel like it's meant to be the nerve centre of a place operating the rest of government. But maybe you shouldn't be thinking of it in those terms. It's meant to be a political place, a place where the political decisions come or not. So the fact that it doesn't have a bleeping Star Trek-style real turns data feel to it, I felt that it worked for the simple reason that whenever you needed to meet anybody, people would come there because they all wanted to come to Downing Street. And that was fundamentally the political capital you needed. So as far as I see, there are optimists of the Dominic Cummings type who imagine a kind of techno-utopia where the data is flowing perfectly and there are all these real-time decisions that need to be made absolutely perfectly, and then it's absolutely not fit for purpose. And the irony is, of course, that he was there during one of the times when that really would have made a difference, during COVID, when there were those really important data-driven decisions. But mostly, if you think you're going into Downing Street because you're going to make really quick, data-driven operational decisions, it's just, that's not meant to be the place for it.
But for me, the ministers, the idea of ministers as kind of chief executives, or if they're even meant to be that, of these giant departments, which was never really envisaged in the British Constitution. And in the American critique, you see the Americans of the late 18th century go, no, the president can appoint, the Secretary of State doesn't have to just be the MP for Epsom. You don't have to choose from this quite limited pool of people who are now expected to run these. Yes. And I do think the turnover of ministers, my wife works in criminal justice, and she has dealt with sort of 10 justice secretaries in 10 years kind of thing. And I think that feels very weird and unhelpful. And that's the same is true of junior rank as well. And I wonder whether that's, how revolutionary is it to think about that kind of American system where you start to, the health secretary is, you employ McNamara to run the Pentagon or whatever. Is that something that's attractive to you, having sat in the office?
I often thought it, partly because we have the shadowy in-between role of the special advisor, who, they can range from like the 28-year-old who's meant to just have an argument with the Daily Mail every 3 hours, to the 45-year-old education policy expert like Lord Adonis. And the latter sort is a really important constitutional kind of creation But you would need to have the accountability framework too, which they have in the States with those terrifying Senate committees, so forth. So we kind of have half botched it by having appointed lords and special advisors appointed with absolutely no process at all, having gone through it twice myself. But I do think it does produce more continuity. Certainly at the end of the New Labour time, the people with institutional memory were all of some of their splendid special advisors who'd been there since the 90s.
Let's look now at the longer-term significance of the period we have just all lived through. Dan, last year we saw 3 prime ministers, 4 chancellors, cost of living crisis, death of the Queen. How did last year compare to previous moments in history?
Well, there have been other years with 3 prime ministers. Usually they've involved a death. So it's quite unusual it's very unusual indeed to have 3, 2 got rid of basically for misbehaviour. And so that was unusual. The royal death often the exact timing was extraordinary, wasn't it? The fact it was in the same week as a new prime minister. But it wasn't. A royal death would come along as a blindsided people like Walpole and things like that. I think the 1922-24, you had 5 ministries in the space of 2 years. Drawn from 3 political parties. I mean, it's always quite interesting to know what's causing the crisis. Is it the kind of curious arithmetic of the House of Commons, which we're told, of course, first past the post gives us these very strong, stable governments. Empirically, I'm just not sure that's true at all. So the early 20s, yes, big dislocation following the First War, succession of Ireland. I mean, lots going on, but kind of particularly unstable, I think, because of the electoral geography at the time and the kind of rising Labour Party and the fact they couldn't get stable majorities in the House. But then you've got the 1780s when you had 3 prime ministers that follow the Battle of Yorktown, greatest reverse of British military history. America goes, most catastrophic wartime failure probably in the last 300 years of British history. So that feels like an external shock to the system. And I think what we had, stable. We had a stable. That's the crazy thing about last year. It was a pretty reasonably stable majority given recent history, and you still had that kind of turbulence. That feels pretty unusual.
So yes, and Giles, you, as you said, you were a special advisor during the coalition. Mm-hmm. At the time, we all thought that was sort of interesting and sort of relatively unusual. But the dramas.
Yeah, we thought we had crises because nobody who put together the budget had ever visited a Greggs. And I mean, that was just a wonderful month in retrospect, but we thought the world was falling about us. It is now, it feels almost uniformly, or maybe it's only the civil servants who agree with this who speak to me, but they say it was a wonderful period of stable government. And listening to Dan's extraordinary rundown of all the other previous governments that have been unstable, I wonder, one of the really big differences, now the party system means that you cling on by your fingernails, even if you know that you don't have the confidence either of your colleagues in Parliament or the country. Whereas it felt like people used to give up power when they didn't feel they had the confidence, almost willingly. They were like, thank goodness I'm not meant to do this job anymore. Yeah. Whereas the feeling under the coalition was we need to cling together because otherwise we're going to be thrown to the wolves. For most of the time, Labour were ahead in the polls. And there's a natural sort of fusion going on there. There was also extraordinarily good work at the beginning of the coalition putting together some kind of agreement, even though a lot of it was garbage. It was put together as a kind of foundational document that you meant to pay attention to. And that was very much the credit of the civil service, who sort of held their nose, looked at the manifestos and produced something that was relatively coherent. But remarkably, the voting population hated it. That's the trouble. They think a coalition's just awful.
Fudge.
Yeah, we need to elect new people.
Who would be a politician? You spend people out there, we, the voters, spend the whole time saying, we just wish these people would work together and get on with it. Yeah. Every time there's a coalition, it gets absolutely hammered in the subsequent elections. It's brutal.
And Dan, 20 years on, push yourself into the future.
Wow.
How will historians talk about this period?
Who knows? I mean, that all depends, doesn't it? It's too soon to tell. I mean, that all depends on if Scotland secedes. The politicians of this period will look like some of the greatest incompetence in British history. If zero, it depends how I think the environment, our climate crisis. As I say, I think we've made pretty good progress. Obviously, not compared to what we need to do, but I think that is something to be proud of and a success story. The North Sea, some of the things going on there. Again, depending on how quick now we move on that, it feels like that will be something that they'll be judged on. I'm pretty sure they won't be judged on clamping down on wokeness at universities. And I think that they will, inevitably, it's the kind of short-term messaging bills that in a kind of scramble to control a short news cycle, other things that will just be forgotten and irrelevant. And it's how do they get on top of AI in a kind of sensible, bipartisan, thoughtful way? And so in a way, it's obviously it's too soon to tell, but I think that those are some of the areas that they might be judged on.
So perhaps this week's online safety bill in the House of Commons will end up being more significant than the antics of last autumn.
Yeah, I mean, and I hope that if there's something that they can be pleased we did in 20 years' time, rather like we are pleased that we have Lord Turner's pension reforms, sort of statement you make in an IfG room and not many other places. If they get on with something that addresses the social care funding crisis, which I know is $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and soon you're talking real money, but 20 billion would probably put it away for 10 years, 15 years. And at some point, actually, the numbers stabilise. And that would be a wonderful reform to bequeath to people. And it's not beyond the wit of man.
Do you agree, and Gemma?
I do agree with all that. I mean, one more to throw into the mix alongside Dan's point about Scotland would be Northern Ireland as well, where the Brexit vote has opened up questions about that. And the polling does show a shift increasingly in favour of asking the question about United Ireland. So that could be another moment where this period happens.
Completely agree. And one that feels like they might have swung at or half swung at, but they were promising to swing at, is land use. Both in terms of housing, but also this as a passionate Remainer, I do agree that I think there was a really interesting opportunity around food, agriculture, rewilding, or sub-payments to farmers. And they seem to have just predictably absolutely stumbled, despite some really interesting ideas and rhetoric around in that area. And I think that, a Britain in which we doubled our forestry cover in the next 20 years would have been a really interesting legacy as well.
Just one more trend to mix. It's kind of what happens with the regional economic policy. Does levelling up go somewhere? Is this the start of some stability in that area of growth, or is it just yet another block on the lovely IfG chart of all the churn in policy in that area?
Whoever's playing IfG bingo has definitely managed to tick off policy churn and ministerial churn. Giles, anyone you'd pick out who you think will come out well, who history will judge kindly from this period?
I think Michael Gove, even though he was a real architect of Brexit, and I will always struggle, like Dan, to forgive entirely the people who I think were rather irresponsibly pushing that when they should have known better. But within government, he was regarded as remarkably direct, effective, identifying the right problems, and in good faith in trying to solve them. He wasn't around long enough at DEFRA to make a difference to the land use argument. I heard really good civil servants saying they wanted to come and work for DEFRA because that was the exciting work they wanted to do when he was there. And he's similarly highly regarded in the levelling up brief. I don't know enough about education, but people tend to mention that too. So I think he might look quite good in history, as well as very interesting.
Gemma, anyone you'd pick out?
I think if you'd asked me just after the autumn statement last year, I would have said possibly Jeremy Hunt. There was interesting hints there in his talking about public service spending, particularly around the NHS. A lot more attention to the detail of what was going on in the service than we've had from previous chancellors who've tended to just focus on what's the headline amount of money going in. I'm slightly reserving judgment on that now, because I think with what we've seen on the nurses' strikes in more recent weeks, it's not clear to me whether that kind of more strategic thinking about the health service is continuing to be there, but possibly.
Perhaps we'll ask you again this time next year. Yeah. Dan?
Boringly, I would say, only in terms of this anecdotal, but I saw quite a lot of Michael Gove up close during on the justice brief, and he was very highly thought of. I attended prison visits with him as my wife's +1, and he had a detailed knowledge, an ability to talk to inmates, prison staff. Like, it was really impressive. And we all forget, well, I doubt you guys do, but there was a really very interesting and fairly progressive big justice bill sitting there in Parliament just before Brexit, which was potentially a game changer, and it just obviously got blown away, just disappeared in terms of parliamentary time and everything else, and tension and focus, and that would have been very, very important in a part of our governmental architecture that's kind of falling apart as well, justice and prisons. So very, very sad to see him leave justice, and sad to see that bill go down as well.
Oh, Michael Gove's going to be very happy with us when you listen to this podcast. Dan, just reflecting now on the constitutional side of things, do you think the constitutional strains of the last half-decade will lead to significant changes, say, in the House of Lords, how we elect our MPs, anything to do with the monarchy, or if we look back from our 20-year period, will nothing have really changed?
I can't believe Labour would be stupid enough to... I mean, if you look at 1906, big for want of a left of centre-ish swing elections, 1906, 1945, 97, I'm surely most of the architects and most of those would have been, having thought they were a bright new realignment of the British political system, it emerged, the old problem that we have divisions on the left and not on the right, although that could change. But I think that they probably should have made some voting changes when they could have done, so that we don't have this consistent problem of very powerful governments, or reasonably powerful governments, with working majorities elected on small minorities of the vote. Whether Labour and Liberal Democrats get their act together and sort that out next time round, House of Lords feels like there's more energy there, but again, that's so easy to get kicked into the long grass, isn't it? And again, that weird thing about the House of Lords actually annoyingly works quite well. Like, it's an odd thing to completely focus on trying to fix the British Constitution. As we say, whether it's ministerial churn, whether it's voting, whether it's to suddenly go, no, what we're going to do is take a hammer to the House of Lords when you've got actually some really quite interesting, amazing people doing good work in there, even though it doesn't make any sense at all. It feels like an odd focus, but I can't believe First Past Post hasn't delivered the kind of stability that is its one supposed attribute. Just hasn't done that ever, frankly, but certainly not, as we know, since 2010.
And yet, when you win under it, you then
it's tempting.
Forgive it anything.
Yeah.
Okay, there's now an opportunity for anyone in the room to ask a question. Please keep it short and sweet. There's a roving mic, and please wait until the mic arrives before you ask your question.
Thanks. Alistair Granger, Net Zero Director at Grant Thornton. With today's news of the sad demise of British Volt, are there any lessons from history in terms of how our industrial policy should be made?
We were interested in the task of building a gigafactory for several years now, and in fact, I would credit my former boss Theresa May with shepherding through a big investment in something called the Faraday Battery Centre, £247 million, to try to lay the groundwork for that. What we didn't think was vital was everything should be homegrown. We thought the right task was to identify that the real experts in that particular field of industry were all Asian companies. Either Chinese or Korean or one or two Japanese. In fact, the original gigafactory in Nevada was basically, I think, a Panasonic factory with a big Tesla wrapper around it. So the sort of industrial policy that we've tended to pursue in the past, where it's been in any way successful, we need to remain open. Openness is still a really great industrial policy. We should have been trying to lead with foreign investors who already had working technology. I don't know enough about that one otherwise. I think it was the right thing to be trying to do, because the normal way that people criticize industrial strategy is to say you can't predict the future, you don't know what's coming. We've mandated that there will only be electric vehicles after a certain point. We've predicted the demand for this, and we've said it's going to be passed in law. We know that electric batteries are not easily transportable, and there's going to be strategic need to have a supply. So absolutely we need one. The mistake we made was not having a consistent enough statement of that fact and then making it absolutely clear to every possible foreign investor that we were open for it. So, yeah, pursue it more wholeheartedly and don't insist on everything being made in Britain with a kind of British ownership wrapper.
Question here at the front.
Hello, Purdy Fraser, Chair of National Numeracy. I noticed when you were talking about how history would judge us in 20 years' time that no one explicitly said they'll judge us on what we do with Europe or where we are in 30 years' time. You obviously touched on it with Northern Ireland and touched on it with Scotland and the implications, but I'd just be interested in whether you might all reflect on how they will judge our relationship with Europe.
I guess that's because I sort of not. I guess I think because we're going to find a kind of weird neutral buoyancy, whether we like it or not, which is sort of Norway-ish, sort of somewhere in that bit of the pie chart. And I don't see, therefore, there being radically different outcomes. The kind of lunar pull, to quote Boris Johnson, of Europe, means that we're neither going to be, I don't think the Singapore on Thames is going to be a thing, and I think we're also not probably going to be back in with the euro and without our opt-outs. So I'm not sure I thought there was a great divergence in where we might sit vis-a-vis Europe, but I no doubt could be wrong.
Yeah, no, I think that's broadly my feeling as well. We've sort of already made the big decisions about the nature of the relationship we'll have with Europe. So, yeah, I think I'm sort of assuming there are not big changes from where we are pretty much now coming down the line.
Can we come to this gentleman in front? No, well, no. William. Oh.
Sorry. Slightly trivial question for Dan, but if you could have dinner with any one Prime Minister, and let's presume you can go back as long as you want, who would it be and why?
Oh,
While Dan just thinks about that, can I ask you to ask the question again and say who you are?
Ask the question again.
And just say who you are before you
sorry.
start. Sorry.
Yeah. My name's William Kijani. I work for Star Sports, and I'd like to ask Dan a slightly trivial question, but one that's burning up inside now. If you could have dinner with any one Prime Minister, and you can go back as long as you like, historian's privilege, who would it be and why?
I'd like to shout at Lord North about about not sending William Howe to try and fight George Washington in the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. I think Pitt the Younger is an absolutely remarkable character, workaholic. The sort of emergence of he does so much to advance this kind of fiscal, military, modern state as we'd recognise it. I think he was extraordinary. Obviously, if you want a good time, Palmerston, Churchill. The Queen preferred Wilson, right? She wanted dinner with him, so he had something going for him. It makes my head fall off. I can't bear it. But yes.
Can I?
No.
Can I say?
I'm going to unilaterally extend the question to Giles.
Can I say that anyone but Edward Heath? I mean, the accounts in his biography was he was capable, often actually towards women, of sitting there, eating his way through 3 courses and ignoring entirely the person next to them. It was the most uncomfortable experience you could have. I imagine Lord Salisbury would have been also pretty forbidding. So if you can, I'll take a lottery apart from those two.
I think I'd probably go Robert Peel for just being a politician who really persuaded his party of things that were very anathema to what they had thought in the past, and the start of more of the welfare state and big economic reform in Britain.
Experiment to see what he could persuade you of. We'll have one last question. Peter.
Yeah, Peter Riddle, former director here. It's following on the Europe question. Looking at relations with the US, Russia, China, because that's going to, in ways we wouldn't necessarily predicted 5-6 years ago, that looking to your perspective view in 20 years' time, how will the UK look then, and what will its implications be?
Well, I think it's very difficult. I think it was a few thousand voters in Georgia and Nevada and elsewhere that by how much we missed out on a second Trump presidency. And I think the second Trump presidency would have had a very different approach to Ukraine, I think. And therefore, we would have found ourselves bounced in potentially to even deeper integration with Europe, and shouldering an even bigger burden if we could of the resistance to Russia. China is, again, I always think back, how do we know? In Britain, British policymakers in 1905, their major concern was Russian influence in South Asia. And I mean, that poor British policymaker sitting over there in Whitehall spent the next 30 years of his or her career, I mean, dealing with all sorts. Whether it's Germany, whether it's naval competition with Japan, the Pacific, the rise of America. I mean, history suggests it's very difficult for us to predict those kind of great power. China, will the CCP be there in 20 years' time, or will? Am I being naive here, or hopeful, optimistic, or will it have been replaced, or will their kind of tech, their sort of technology-led dictatorship be even more effective, and that country be under even tighter surveillance and control than it is now? Today, in the news, because they're talking about their demographic crisis, they've got. Will that make them try and strike at Taiwan sooner rather than later because they can now, or do they think like Germany fighting Russia in 1914? Let's get them now, while we still can, or is demography destiny, and China will the Chinese will sort of recede from the world stage as quickly as they. So I can't answer that question, but
interesting.
Wow.
Interesting.
Well, then what chance do I have? But I would say, I mean, the optimist in me says, from my much briefer reading of history, that really warlike situations have often come about when there's been a really burgeoning young population, growing and expanding, a sort of frustrated middle class like the Japanese trying to expand, the Germans sort of bursting their way out and trying to find. And we're now going through the big dominant factor of the years ahead, apart from the climate change, is demographic change. Today we had the headline about China's population peaking. If the Chinese leaders have any common sense, their concerns are going to be very much internal.
Yeah.
And that's my optimistic side. I know that they are a system of governance and thinking that is very alien to ours in lots of ways and very scary. What the things they're prepared to do to their own people are extremely concerning. But I don't think that there's an analogy between them and the expansionary Russian Empire or the expansionary would-be German Empire. I think common sense should dictate that we have the most culturally in common with Europe, and we will inevitably want to be drawn there. I think the finest places in the world, are the cities that are taking on challenges that we want to aspire to emulate, are all in Europe. And we are finally the most extraordinary military force of all time by a long distance is America. We are free riding on American security to a large degree. And that needs to be an important fact that our policymakers think about, that where would we be without them? And
my short, better answer would be the American guarantee seems a lot more fragile than it did 5 years ago. And I think we just need to be very, and therefore it could go any way, but it's nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
If your security is dependent on the current governor of Florida, then it's a bit scary.
And on that not very uplifting note.
Sorry about that.
That's it for this special episode of Inside Briefing. My huge thanks to Gemma Tetlow, Giles Wilkes, and especially to Dan Snow. Thank you so much for being with us. A big thank you to our podcast partners, Podmasters, for producing this episode, and to Grant Thornton for sponsoring today's conference. And of course, for the first time, a really big thank you to you, our live audience. Thank you for listening and for all your great questions. Thank you to everyone who's listening at home. Remember, you can find all our podcasts at iTunes, Spotify, and all major platforms. And do leave us a review. If you liked this live recording, then perhaps we'll try and do some more. Because right now in British politics, whether we look forward or back, or just try and make sense of what on earth is going on, there's an awful lot to talk about. Goodbye.
Lovely quote of yours I just found today was that one about Cicero complaining about it.
Okay, so I'm afraid we will let you go, but you have to sit through a few closing remarks for me, I'm afraid. That's it for the IfG's Government 2023 conference. I'm delighted with the level of the discussion that we've had. Thanks again to Grant Thornton for sponsoring. And thank you to the entire IfG team who have really worked hard to put on today's fantastic sessions. To run you quickly through what we've done, we had a fantastic session at the start looking at all the multiple challenges facing government this year. Sam Friedman and Ayesha Hazarika agreed to incomprehension about how the government is handling public sector strikes. There was some chinks of light amidst all the doom and gloom. Paul Johnson told us that maybe the economic news might be a little better than we had feared later in the year, and Chloe Smith argued for the vital importance of general elections in enabling politicians to debate big questions. Let's hope the politicians live up to that as aspiration. Next, we moved on to the civil service. Munira Mirza looked at the distinction between reforms we think are needed and that the government should just get on with, and those that are more contentious. And Permanent Secretary Antonio Romeo was keen to say that permanent secretaries are on the side of reform and a motivated workforce, and said that but interestingly said that the key qualities that civil servants have needed over the last 5 years were resilience and courage. Our keynote with Penny Mordaunt was next. She admitted that her account of where we are as a country was depressing, but she claimed to be an optimist for the future, and she ranged widely, I would say, from what was a very optimistic view of the possibilities for restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster without MPs moving out, to the importance of enhancing accountability and the power of good data. After lunch, we had a brilliant, slightly ad hoc IfG expert briefing, covering the Institute's thoughts on civil service, public services, constitution in Northern Ireland, and obviously that was just a snapshot of all the brilliant thinking and work that goes on here at the Institute. And we look forward to welcoming the SNP Stephen Flynn at a later date when parliamentary business allows. Lisa Nandy's keynote came next. She set out Labour's vision for levelling up and spreading power throughout the country, and the structures in the institutions we need to deliver that. And we were especially pleased to hear Lisa announce Labour's intention to create an advisory council to monitor progress on achieving levelling up, which is an IfG recommendation. And building on the themes that came through in Lisa's session, our final panel was on devolving power and tackling regional inequality. And what was notable there, I think, was the level of political agreement we saw about the fact that devolution is a necessary part of the solution to regional inequality. And finally, we let our hair down with this fantastic panel and this live recording of Inside Briefing. I hope you've all found today as interesting and stimulating as I have. I look forward to welcoming you back to the Institute for more events throughout the year. Please check out our amazing new website, which has details of everything coming up, including, and there's the lady there who did all the hard work on it, Melissa, including a briefing from Jonathan Brearley, CEO of Ofgem, on Monday, so do tune in to that one. And we look forward to seeing you all throughout the rest of the year.